Hello, everyone. I'd like to thank SciPep for making time for this session. My name is Ben Wiehe. I'm really pleased to be moderating this session uh, on meeting people where they are or inviting them over. The session's really about going to where the people are. On the face of it, this is a simple notion, but it very literally opens up a whole world of different audiences and participants, social settings, and cultural contexts for science. Now, outreach is definitely not new. There's nothing particularly novel about showing up where the people are instead of always asking them to come to you. I mean, I personally have the keys to the Science Center outreach van more than 20 years ago, and at the time it was a very old van. I enjoyed driving it, but community outreach, going to where the people are, is rarely taken very seriously. And by that, I mean that relatively few resources go into it. It doesn't typically get much attention. And there's very little agreement about the most basic language to use when talking about it, which is why we're stuck with clunky phrases like going where the people are. Well, today we have 4 people, including myself, that feel passionately about the potentials that open up when we go where the people are. We feel strongly that these many potentials merit serious consideration, even when the outreach itself is seriously fun and playful. We have between us all decades of experience with going where the people are. But you'll notice that each of us have been doing this in very different contexts with different goals, resources, and levels of organizational support. A big wide world out there once you walk out your front door, and there are almost too many directions to go. So for each of us, the specific differences in our own experiences matter. So we'll be each be discussing this topic through the lens of our own experiences. And I'd just like to introduce our team, and if they can join us on camera, I'll start with Paula. Paula Croxson is a neuroscientist, a storyteller, and science communicator. She received an MA from the University of Cambridge and a master's in science and a PhD from the University of Oxford. She was an assistant professor of neuroscience at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai in New York, where her work investigated the neural basis of memory. She's now an associate director for public programs at Columbia University Zuckerman Institute, where she leads community-based and public science programming. She brings science to people in a wide variety of ways, from science fairs and high school internships to collaborations with artists, comedians, and musicians. She's also a senior producer for the Story Collider, a nonprofit dedicated to sharing true personal stories about science. She was awarded the Society for Neuroscience Science Educator Award and was a finalist for the AAAS Early Career Award for Public Engagement with Science. Deepti Pradhan is the founder and president of Tilde Cafe. She has a PhD in chemistry from the Indian Institute of Technology and pursued a stimulating career in biochemistry and cell biology at Penn State, Cornell, and now Yale. Nowadays, she applies her scientific training to data analytics and visualization in the capacity of associate director in the Yale Office of Development and to cancer patient and survivor advocacy. Deepti also writes and sometimes draws about science to expand science awareness. Her work has been recognized with awards from the New Haven chapter of the American Chemistry Society and the Rika Welsh Community Impact Award. Mark Rosin is the U.S. Director and co-founder of Guerilla Science and Associate Professor of Physics at the Pratt Institute of Art and Design. His research and practice work with Guerilla Science mixes science with art, music, and play, creating live events in the places and spaces they're least expected, music festivals, pop-up urban centers, and art galleries. Mark received his PhD from the University of Cambridge in applied mathematics before completing a Department of Energy-funded postdoc at UCLA. He is the winner of the AAAS Early Career Award for Public Science Engagement with Science and an Ashoka Foundation Emerging Innovator. Might have mingled his last name.
We didn't compete, but he would have won anyway if we'd been
yes,
in the same year for
I
that
noted.
award.
All right.
But I followed in your footsteps, Mark, by several years, I think.
We're all on the same team. Now, as for myself, I'm the manager. My name's Ben Wiehe. I'm the manager of the experimental practice team at the MIT Museum and the founding manager of the Science Festival Alliance. We're now just weeks away from opening up a new web resource for a 4-year national project called Science in Vivo. This project has involved activity by 20 teams across the US that have found some way to integrate a science experience into existing cultural gatherings, going where the people are, but then making sure that when you do, you become a full participant in those gatherings. So I've started talking about this as situated engagement that takes cultural context and social setting as primary to any science content. When our site's available in August, it will be at situatedengagement.org, and it will start by looking at 4 categories of activity: science on parade, neighborhood science, con science, which is science experiences integrated into fantasy conventions, and pop-up retail as science engagement. Okay, so there's going to be a Q&A at the end of this, and we need you to, the only way we're going to hear your voice is if you place questions or comments into the questions section. You're not going to be able to see others' questions in that section, but I'll do my best to curate that and honor what appears there. But to get us started, leaving behind the comforts of home base carries with it many implications. It's not business as usual for most. It can produce unique outcomes, but also just requires different approaches to science engagement or science communication. So I was hoping that the 3 speakers today could introduce the initiatives that they represent and are represented on the posters that are presented here at SciPep by sharing what you have for those that are interested in doing this themselves. And Paula, if you don't mind, let's start with you and any thoughts you have.
Yeah, sure. Thanks so much, Ben. I feel this is a relatively new direction for us, and it's one that I'm really excited about. So I work at Columbia University. It's big. It's situated, particularly the institute in which I work is situated in the depths of Harlem. It's relatively new. It's one of a cluster of new research buildings that were put up, I think, around 5 years ago, and it's continuing to be built. And I think this program in part grew out of a recognition that the university needs to do more to acknowledge our place in the world in which we exist. I once took a guerrilla science workshop, and one thing that really stuck with me was this phrase that I don't remember which of the instructors came up with that really summarized this idea that people, they don't just come for a bit of science in a vacuum. They come from their lives and they go back to their lives. And we're just like a little part of it as we interact with other people. And that in the case of a university like Columbia, in a place like Harlem, the upper Manhattan and South Bronx community, it really is important to acknowledge our place there and what people's lives are like. And so I think this came out of a desire for us to maybe get out of our space entirely, and to think about making intentional partnerships with community-based organizations. And for us, a really great place to start was to partner with other sort of, cultural organizations. So maybe these are organizations that are also kind of established. They're local Harlem organizations, but they were things like museums. So we began our collaboration with the National Jazz Museum in Harlem, which is one of our neighbors. It's not very far away. And then we expanded out to partner with a number of different cultural organizations, such as the Harlem International Film Festival, the Studio Museum in Harlem, and the Dance Theater of Harlem. These are like impressive institutions in their own right. And so I just want to add a note that maybe the end goal and our desire here is to go beyond those big, impressive cultural institutions and form more grassroots collaborations, but that we needed to understand that we can't just leap straight in. There's been a great question that's come up again and again and again in the sessions in this meeting of, are you the person who should be doing this work? Is it you who should be here in this space? And I think we think about that constantly when we're doing this kind of work. So just thinking about who we partner with, and maybe the order in which we approach those people and the way in which we approach those organizations has been really important to us. So one of the things that we have done is we've thought really carefully about how we approach our partners. We don't usually ask for an ongoing partnership straight away. We come proposing a one-off event of some kind, a taste or a test of what we can do together. We come being really, really clear about what we can bring to the table. That might be finances, that might be resources, marketing, event planning, science, obviously, science and scientists and mental health professionals. Sometimes Columbia University's name can be helpful. We come being very, very clear what we can offer, and then we do a lot of listening. So one thing that was very, very important to us in forming these collaborations and producing these events, which are science art partnerships, was to run them in the way that our partner would run an event. Most of these were done online because we started the program in 2019, but had to switch in 2020 to virtual events almost straight away. So we were looking at platforms that our partners were using, like Facebook Live or YouTube, also mixing and matching small, very intimate events on Zoom, with like bigger panel discussions that were broadcast to thousands of people on YouTube. And really deferring to our partners' knowledge of their audience, of their art, of how they would do things. Quite often, they wanted to do the production, the marketing, make materials, to come up with the content with us, and to really let them take the lead. There's another really strong sort of perennial thread about trust in science. In this field of public engagement, should people trust science? Do they? Why don't they? I think that goes the other way too. We have been able to trust our partners to do things their way and then to come on board with them to do that. And I think we've been really honored to have partners where we could trust them, but also why wouldn't we? They're the experts in their area. And then maybe the last thing I'll mention, and then I'll pass it over to someone else, will be the importance for us of not pushing any particular scientific message or content. So even though we engage with scientists in the building who do have really fascinating research, we've usually allowed that to come out by having the other participants, the artists, ask the questions of the scientists, and have the amount of science that goes into the event be the right amount. And somebody asked earlier in our poster session, whether that dilutes the content, the science content. And yeah, maybe it does. And maybe that's great, that the amount of science content is not the focus here. What the focus is coming together with our partners to find where the common ground is, and to find where there is intersection and overlap between art and science.
Paula, I've seen a couple questions come in, but we're going to leave those for a little bit later. Deepti, my original question was just to ask you to reflect on any kind of any kind of advice that you might share with those that are interested in doing this themselves, specifically around any unique outcomes that you've seen or different approaches that this is required. And you don't have to agree with Paula on everything, but thank you very much, Paula. That was fantastic.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. And Paula, I hope when things open up properly, I can come and attend one of your events. So Tilde Cafe is very different from Paula's approach because it's not associated with any university or any institution for that matter. It's independent, and it provides a model, I believe, because I've been able to share it with others, where members from the community who are interested in science can invite speakers who are experts in their field and in a very simple, non-pedagogical situation environment, share their research in a relatively simple manner. So without too many equations, which people find overwhelming. I've managed to sustain this for some time now. And it arose from a frustration with misinformation or inadequate information pertaining to science. And so in 2008, when I started it, it started as what I did think was a naive idea, but it seems to have clicked. And so all these years later, I think the very fact that I've been able to sustain it, I think is a demonstration that the model does not necessarily require engaging the community with science does not necessarily require institutional participation. So I'll let Mark share some of his ideas.
Thank you, Deepti. Go ahead, Mark.
Thanks for having me, everyone, and nice to be here. I think Paula and Deepti summarized a lot of what I was going to say really, really well. And I think the only points I really have to make are to try and connect some of the things that they've said to maybe adjacent schools of thought, maybe back them out a bit, and see if they land, if framed slightly differently. So, all the speakers so far have talked really well and really accurately about the value of community brokers and local expertise. Now, my work for the past 10 or so years has been in creating integrated science art programming and embedding it into, broadly speaking, the kind of cultural places and spaces that aren't normally affiliated with science. So places like music festivals, public art festivals, nightclubs, things like that. And in those contexts, what community brokers and local experts do are not things that I think generally as educators or scientists we think of as highly skilled, essential components of our work, but they are in fact. So for example, one of the most valuable skill sets that you can bring to a publicly embedded event at something like music, valuable skills you can bring is the skill of being a producer. Now that's a whole discipline that you can study at an undergraduate level. They might call it experience design or communication design, but it's about making the event run smoothly. It's about taking into account all the varied physical, psychological, social needs of the participants. It's about making sure things run on time and smoothly, and all the goings on behind the scenes aren't noticed, much like the people who are running and organizing this conference have done. They're all very skilled professionals. Now, within the setting of a cultural venue, these people are extremely important, extremely valued by both the people that work at that organization and the publics that attend. And I think it's really important that as collaborators, we're cognizant of the value that's placed on those people by their communities, even if it's not people that we directly have experience working with. I would say that this is actually this kind of thinking is really a form of kind of asset-based approach to learning. We just have to recognize that the assets that a cultural community, for example, values are assets like, for example, production skills or theatre production, or things like that. So I'd say this is nothing that the other speakers haven't said, but it's useful to think about it like that. The other big thing that I've learned, having done this for 10, maybe even 15 years, is something that builds off what was said by John Besley prior to the conference in kind of the pre-conference literature review. And that is that I think it's really useful to be very open-minded about the long-term goals. So the long-term objectives of your, no, he says goals, the long-term goals of your work. So the kind of short-term interventions that all of our programs do, mine more than I think Paula's or Deepti's. So people are engaging with us maybe for an hour, maybe twice, but often only once. The kind of things that might result from that are going to be very, very, very hard to measure and occur within, a life trajectory of which we are just a small blip. And so I think it's really useful to be open-minded and realistic about the kind of change you're likely to affect. And that's helpful because it gives you some freedom to think about other things you might achieve. And often those things are going to be providing experience, engaging novel publics for the scientists you work with, more than really affecting any sort of systemic change on the community. It might be bringing in leadership at your institution to see the value of this work. It might be that the scientists you're working with are learning something apropos of two-way engagement, or it might be just building trust between you and your community partner. So those are, I think, my two broad lessons. I thought I would also, just for helpfulness, stick a little resource in the chat. So I've got a very talented colleague in the UK called Jen Wong, and so she actually wrote many years ago a little document in a conference report, which I've just pasted in the chat, which is something like 10 tips for working with arts festivals. And even a while on, I think they're very useful. So page 14 of the link I just put in the chat. Thank you.
I think that it's fun. It's funny to present on this sort of work even in a conference setting, because it's such a constrained and formal place. Now, that's not to knock our conferences. It's just to say that my experience in general with this, especially observe what's going on, is that there's the environment that we're in when we go to where the people are is so loaded with cultural meaning and so loaded with social exchanges and social power dynamics that it makes my head spin sometimes, and I'm not knowing that I'm not aware of everything that's taking place in a particular setting. So Mark suggested that in order to evaluate this or look at, are we making outcomes, are we hitting long-term goals? It's just extraordinarily difficult to do when the setting itself is dynamic and changing. The cultures themselves are dynamic and changing, and the relationships between each other. To pinning them down is a little bit of an exercise. So with the Science in Vivo project, I have to say we have sent two observers who are not familiar with the context to observe these things in action, and then they critique the work. Part of that is to start to scratch a little bit below the surface at okay, when you're doing this work yourself, you don't have the opportunity to see yourself in the context. You don't have the opportunity to see yourself in the setting. Now, I'm not saying that everybody needs to send a pair of observers and follow our critique protocol for Science in Vivo. What I'm saying is that one of the most important things to me is the ability to take yourself out of what you're doing in your particular activity at times and look around you and have the situational awareness to recognize that every setting is loaded with cultural meaning, implicit, explicit, intended or not intended. And you can choose to be a cultural actor, or you can choose to pretend that you're not, but it doesn't matter. You're still sending messages. So we have some questions that have come in. There's activity in the chat. I'm trying to, there's a chat, there's the questions, there's a chat, there's the questions. I'm gonna try to stick to the queue and to the actual questions. I want to jump right to one. It's that asks about selling leadership on the less science content principle. So it says, did you have problems selling leadership on that less science content principle? And this was originally intended for you, Paula, but this is a question for all of us. And I would say not just on the less science content principle, but because there are several aspects of doing this work that really are different than business as usual for institutions and organizations that are science first, especially those that are facility focused like museums or some kind of university campuses. And so what kind of friction have you felt, or if you have tips for eliminating that friction with in my introduction I said, like, I don't think this is taken seriously enough. I have some reasons why I think that may be the case, but if any of the speakers want to jump in.
So I can tell you, because my response will be really short because I'm not working with any institution. But the issue of diluting the science, which Paula mentioned, someone asked, it sometimes I have to convey to the person who's going to speak for a cafe event that don't make it so turgid that those people who are not your peers are not going to understand anything that you're saying. So it is a challenge for the scientists to, without diluting their science, to reframe their vocabulary. And I would say almost everyone who's spoken, or more than 100 speakers who've spoken, have said that it has been a challenge, but it's been a rewarding experience, because you have to step aside from your typical lab environment and the language you are used to, and convey the significance of your work without diluting it because you're not using the jargon. So it's a challenge for the speakers, not so much for me.
Yeah, absolutely. We've definitely work a lot with scientists to figure out, what's the right amount of content, and of course that varies depending on which publics you're talking to. And yeah, so let me try and directly answer this question. I'll start by saying I'm lucky. I think I'm lucky to work under leadership who trust me to do my work, and that's really what it comes down to. It's more about trust, which is a thing that's difficult to measure in any circumstance. Essentially, I think that I'm fortunate enough to work with leadership who know that the person or the people who are best qualified to know how much science is enough are the people doing the work, not the leadership. So in some senses, I can't speak to this very well because I haven't had to do a lot of selling of this, because I think that we've been given the chance to demonstrate through our work what is possible, and how it's possible to draw people in. But I also think it's a little bit of a reframing. And the other way in which I'm fortunate is that we actually have a communications team at my institute as well, who are excellent at delivering the message. It's not always one-way communication, but it's often one-way communication, blog posts and podcasts and press releases. And they do a great job of sharing the science that's happening in the institute to those who want to go in depth. So I think another good way to phrase that is, if you're the person doing that and there's only one of you or there's only one team, possibly it's good to, and you have leadership who are a little skeptical, it's good to have multiple levels of approach. So it's not the case that all of our work is this way. We can have people who come to seek educational content, who have like in-depth experiences in science labs over the summer, like our high school students. And we can create experiences like this, where we place less focus on delivering the science content. And I think over time, we've come within our institute to just to reframe what it means to engage the public with science, and to think about it less as people need to understand more science. And that's easy, just send people papers about how the deficit model doesn't work. And instead think about what it means to welcome people into science, to make people feel as if they belong in science, and to be humble as scientists about our place in society. Those reframings don't make it at all necessary for us to communicate any kind of science at all. But that, you can't do that overnight, right? If you're working with a skeptical leadership, you need to take small steps, which, let's face it, is how everything gets done.
Mark, we have more questions, but do you have anything you want to add to that?
I would say that Paula hit the nail pretty nicely on the head, and you know, to summarize both what she was saying and bring in what we heard from Bruce Lewinstein at the beginning. You know, science is not just about scientific content; it's also a process, and it's a set of institutions. So talking about those has huge value, and if we think of one of the objectives we try and often hit, even though we should be hitting goals, if we think about a learning objective, the acquisition of scientific knowledge is actually a pretty narrow objective, and maybe we'd be better off thinking about learning from a socio-cultural perspective. And if we're doing that, then of course it's important to be talking about not just facts, but also about who does science and why we do science. And so all of these things are just buttressing what the other speakers have said very nicely.
Mm-hmm. And the real potential that I've seen through the Science in Vivo project is transformation of the teams that are participating, the potential for those teams to eventually bring that transformation home to roost and begin to change the organization that they're embedded within. There's a number of questions now about, they're starting to come. There's too many of them. We're not going to get to them all. We have less than 10 minutes left. I see several around the issue of centering community. If that's, you know, if I could lump them together. There's a question about where, when letting the community guide a conversation, do we find that people are, you know, interested in a particular avenue, or are they mainly interested in basic or discovery science or applied science, or, you know, something along those lines? There's also a question about that I'm going to add to this. So you can ask, like, well, when the community's guiding the conversation, where do they go? But then there's also a point here saying that meeting where the people are as a phrase can carry something a little bit of a negative connotation, in the sense that it implies the audience is not as far along as the scientists, and we need to go help them, bring them up to speed, which is not a connotation that I've thought of when you know, like quite the opposite movement. So I wonder if there's you know, what the panelists thought, you know, reactions are to that. We have two different nested things in there.
Can I jump on?
Yeah, please.
So there was a concept that came out of French theatre in the 1960s, and I almost feel like a cliche in referencing theatre or practice from the 60s. But anyway, they talked about it was talked about non-visitors. So people who used to go to the theatre in France were called the visitors. And then they had this whole segment that was just defined as non-visitors. And I think that's kind of talking about when we talk about the people in some sort of amorphous way. It's quite a useful kind of social or, I guess, audience profiling concept. But I definitely agree that there's something paternalistic about it in describing almost it as like people in want of bettering. So I'm completely open to that. I haven't come across any better language, although I think it is not a million miles away from talking about publics. And I kind of tend to conceptualize it just as a way of doing audience segmentation, just thinking about the different needs, wants, psychographics, demographics, and what you might do to make the event suitable for them. So that is 2 cents worth.
I mean, I think this is also a French word, but I'm a big fan of the word collaboration. Here, I don't really think of it as us going to the publics and, being like, here, have some science. I think true collaboration, right, requires whoever's collaborating, and sometimes it's many, so often there's like many individuals. I'll mention the folks who work behind the scenes, the producers and the stage managers, and the artists themselves, the scientists themselves. It can be very complicated, and we've talked a lot in our team about whether or not one can sort of make this plug and play and have like a rubric for how to do it. And in some ways you can, and in some ways you can't, right? Because in a true collaboration, there has to be these fluid discussions, figure out what people's interests are, figure out what people are passionate about, and then work from there. So I don't know if that's a better word, but that's how I think it can be helpful to think about working with others to produce something, which in some ways, it's only science in the sense that science is everywhere. It's only science in the sense that scientists are humans and artists, and everybody is a scientist in some way. But the more I talk about that, the more kind of, I guess, cliche I sound. So I might not go further down that route, but I don't think, maybe meeting people where they are is helpful, though, in this physical sense, in that I think it's been very, very helpful for us to leave our building and in the virtual world, our own virtual platforms to make things happen. So I'm not quite ready to get rid of that phrase entirely.
And leaving not just your home institution's campus behind, but leaving behind the trappings of your home campus or your home base and your entourage. I mean, you can't build new relationships. You're not willing to change yourself, and you surround yourself with things that prevent that change from happening. So the idea of going to where the people are might suggest, if in a negative connotation, that there's no willingness to change on your part. But going to where the people are with an openness to change is a different thing. That's a different movement. Deepti, I don't know if we had two kind of nested questions around centering community. Would you like to add something? Is there something on your mind? I see a smile.
No, I just want to reinforce what both Paula and Mark have said, in that you have to respect the audience. And I think that even as an organizer, even though I never speak at the cafes other than in introducing the speakers, and then I send out summary emails, I find it very important to not be presumptuous about people's level of knowledge of the subject. So being respectful of the people who are attending, because very often there'll be To my surprise, there'll even be faculty from other departments or from some other university who just happen to be in town visiting their family, and they'll come to attend the talk. So there's a whole diverse population that comes for the Science Cafe events. I don't know if that answers the question at all.
No, thank you. I mean, we're getting close to the end of this, and I see that our session ends in about 4.5 minutes, and I'm wondering. I see several questions that are related to getting started, or just thinking about new spaces, or new contexts, or new settings to be working within. I know this is kind of a reprise of my original question, but like for someone who's just kind of thinking about this, how do you begin to conceptualize? Like, where do you start?
I think you start with at least this would be my suggestion. Just be ready to fail. Don't be embarrassed about failing, because as long as you're passionate about getting the word out, you're definitely going to encounter, certainly I did encounter a lot of hurdles, but as long as you're willing to persevere, you will end up with a base of people who continue to spread the word and bring new people to listen to scientists speaking in a very non-lecture like format, and engage in a discussion rather than lecturing at the people there. So be ready to fail. Don't be afraid.
Mark, I saw you have. Thank you, Deepti. I saw you have an immediate reaction to the question.
Well, I think I'd almost kick it back to you, Ben. You've been running a community of practice around taking events into public spaces. I've been doing it for a good 5 or 10 years when I joined your community. So I think some of the introductory sessions had some value, but maybe weren't tailored to me. I wonder whether you've got feedback about whether your community of practice approach worked, what your lessons were in building that.
Not fair. I didn't expect a question directed at me. I think that the most important thing that, in my experience with the live event community, is to find a way to have the bandwidth to look outside of science communication altogether, with an observant, like, emotional hat on, where you are saying, like, where is the emotion in things? Where's the energy that you get really excited about? And then you can bring a tabletop of hands-on activities to something and never actually realize where you were. You could be at a bustling fair, you could be at a zoo, you could be on a boardwalk. You could never know that you were where you were, because you were heads down the whole time, working with kids, doing same hands-on activities that you've been doing for the past 10 years. But the moment that you stop doing that, walk around and start thinking to yourself, well, where do I fit in here? Where do I see the potential for, if not me to participate, then others to be like stepping up and finding their place in here. So I think that it starts with being able to zoom out and forget about the science for a moment and make the cultural context and social setting the most important thing. If it doesn't work for that, then it's not going to work for science. So if an event doesn't work as an event, it's not going to work as a science event. That'd be my first place to start. Pull yourself out of all the things of your daily desk life. You can find Deepti and Mark and Paula and myself via this SciPep. So thank you guys for participating. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Thanks everyone for coming.
Bye all.